Imagine your greatest honor in life, being knighted because you wiped the king's bottom. That is not an exaggeration. In the court of King Henry VIII of England, the man chosen for this duty was called the groom of the stool. His job: to attend to the king's most private bodily functions, to monitor every bowel movement, to wipe him clean, and to record the health of his stools as carefully as a doctor would study a patient. It was the filthiest job in the kingdom. Yet it was also one of the most powerful, because in Tudor England, to wipe the king's flesh was to earn his trust, and to have his trust meant access to riches, land, titles, and influence over matters of life and death. Henry VIII was not a man to be crossed. He was unpredictable, gluttonous, paranoid, and vicious. But those who served as his grooms of the stool endured this humiliation for the chance to be closer to him than anyone else at court. This is the story of how a handful of men, bound to the king by filth, found themselves at the very heart of Tudor politics. A story of power, betrayal, and the terrifying intimacy of serving the most dangerous monarch in English history. To understand how such a filthy job could exist, we have to step back into the late medieval world. Kings of England, like all monarchs of Europe, were surrounded by attendants who managed every aspect of their lives. They dressed them, they served their meals, they carried their swords, and yes, they even handled their most private bodily functions. Nothing was considered too personal when it came to serving the crown. But the stool, the royal excrement, held a strange and morbid importance. In an age of rotten meat, heavily salted food, endless aisle, and almost no understanding of hygiene, the state of one's bowels could mean life or death. A king's health was the kingdom's health. If Henry Tudor, or his son Henry VIII, fell ill with constipation, bloody flux, or any intestinal disorder, it could plunge the court into crisis. And so, someone had to watch, record, and manage what came out of the royal body. The position of groom of the stool first appeared under Henry II, the careful, penny-counting founder of the Tudor dynasty. But it was under his son, Henry VIII, that the role became something far stranger. Henry VIII did not merely treat the groom of the stool as a servant. He treated him as a confidant, a gatekeeper, and in many ways, the most intimate figure in the royal household. By cleaning the king's body, the groom earned not only his trust, but his secrets. And in a court ruled by paranoia, that trust could make or break a man's fortunes. So what exactly did the groom of the stool do? His title makes it sound like one simple, degrading task. But in truth, his responsibilities were far more intimate and far more revolting. Every day, Henry VIII's bodily functions became the business of the royal household. The groom had to monitor the king's bowels with the diligence of a physician. Each stool was checked for frequency, color, texture, and even smell, clues to the king's health that might signal disease or decline. Remember, in an era when doctors believed in humours and leeches, a royal turd was more valuable than a medical text. But observation was only the beginning. When the king finished relieving himself, it was the groom's sacred duty to clean him. Yes, wipe him. To physically take cloth to flesh. To ensure that no trace of waste remained on the royal person. It was an act of humiliation for the groom, and one of absolute power for the king. And yet, in this grotesque intimacy, a strange bond was formed. These men touched the monarch in ways no courtier, no wife, and no mistress ever could. The groom also prepared and maintained the closed stool, the royal toilet itself. Forget chamber pots made of brass or clay. Henry's closed stool was a padded wooden box, lined with cushions and covered in fine cloth, sometimes velvet, sometimes leather. It was portable, carried wherever the king travelled, so that his dignity and his bowels were never neglected. The groom ensured it was ready at all times, clean, discreet, and fit for a king's rear end. What's most chilling is the trust this required. The groom of the stool did not simply clean filth. He managed the most private secrets of Henry's body. He knew how often the king was constipated, whether he bled, whether his digestion was failing. In a court where whispers could topple empires, such knowledge was dangerous, and it gave the groom a power far beyond his disgusting duty. So who were these men, these chosen few, whose greatest honor in life was tending to Henry VIII's royal backside? Surprisingly, they were not lowly servants. They were knights and gentlemen of high birth, men of ambition who understood that wiping the king's stool was not humiliation but opportunity. The first was Sir William Compton, one of the earliest grooms of the stool. He began as Henry's childhood companion and rose with him into manhood. As groom, Compton gained unrivaled access to the king's ear. While others schemed in the shadows of the court, Compton could whisper to Henry while handing him a cloth. He became wealthy, powerful, and respected, not despite his duty, but because of it. Then there was Sir Henry Norris, perhaps the most infamous groom of the stool. Norris was a close confidant, trusted with the king's body and his secrets. But proximity to Henry was dangerous. When Anne Boleyn, Henry's ill-fated queen, was accused of adultery, Norris was named as one of her lovers. The charge was almost certainly false, a political move to destroy Anne, but Norris paid with his life. He was executed, proving that even the king's intimate servants were never truly safe from the axe. Sir Thomas Heneage followed, a shrewd courtier who turned his stool duty into a career of immense influence. Heneage became a central figure in Henry's court politics, controlling access, whispers, and documents. The groom's role was no longer just wiping. It was about controlling what information reached the king, and what never did. Finally, there was Sir Anthony Denny, Henry's groom of the stool in the king's final years. Denny was more than a servant. He became Henry's closest advisor as the king's body decayed into ruin. He managed not only the close stool, but also Henry's deathbed. It was Denny who told the dying monarch that the end was near, and who controlled which courtiers were allowed into the royal chamber during those last dreadful days. His filthy duty had transformed into the ultimate seat of power. These men, Compton, Norris, Heneage, and Denny, proved the twisted reality of the Tudor court. Wiping the king's bottom was a shortcut to power, wealth, and political survival. But it was also a razor's edge. One day you might be whispering in the king's ear. The next you might be on the scaffold, your head severed for a crime you did not commit. It seems absurd. The idea that the filthiest task in the kingdom could also be the most coveted. Yet under Henry VIII, that was exactly the case. The groom of the stool wasn't just a servant with a rag. He was a gatekeeper, a confidant, a shadow minister. When Henry sat upon his velvet stool, stripped of robes, rank, and dignity, the groom was there. In those moments of weakness, the king listened. A whispered suggestion, a name mentioned, a warning murmured, all sank deeper than courtly speeches in glittering halls. This was the only man who saw Henry truly vulnerable, and vulnerability breeds trust. The groom also controlled access. No letter, no gift, no request could reach the king without his knowledge. If a nobleman wanted an audience, he might find himself bowing not to Henry, but to the man who wiped Henry's arse. What began as humiliation became leverage, and the rewards were staggering. Lands, titles, fortunes, all poured into the hands of these men. Every groom of the stool under Henry was knighted. To outsiders, it seemed grotesque, nobles kneeling for the privilege of touching filth. But to the ambitious, it was a golden path. Power through filth, influence through waste. The irony was complete. The king's waste became the source of his servants' wealth. To understand the groom of the stool, you have to step back and imagine the reeking world of Tudor England. The toilet wasn't a flushable convenience. It was a wooden box, a hole cut in the center, lined with velvet cushions and cloth. A servant would empty the contents into buckets, and those buckets would eventually make their way outside the palace walls. Even for a king, the throne was still just a stool. For Henry, there was comfort velvet lining, perfumed cloth, attendants with soft linen. But outside the palace gates, London was drowning in human waste. Chamber pots were emptied straight into the streets with a shout of "Gardiloo!" as urine and feces splashed onto cobblestones below. The filth ran in the gutters, mixing with horse dung, slaughterhouse blood, and the rot of fish markets. Rats fed well, and with them came plague. The irony was brutal. The king might rest his enormous body on a velvet-lined commode, but filth still clung to him. His ulcerated legs festered. The air in his chambers stank, and no velvet could disguise the fact that Tudor England was a world of rot. In the end, royalty and commoner alike lived in a kingdom where excrement was never far away. Even on a throne of silk, a man could not escape the stink of his age. After Henry VIII's bloated body was lowered into the earth, the filthiest office in England did not vanish overnight. The groom of the stool survived into later reigns, but with every passing monarch, the title was polished, its origins conveniently forgotten. Under the Tudors, and then the Stuarts, it slowly shifted into something more palatable. The groom of the stole, a servant, who oversaw the monarch's clothing rather than his bowels. The role that once meant kneeling by a velvet toilet, recording the king's excrement like scripture, evolved into something more fashionable, less humiliating. By the 17th century, the groom of the stool was no longer wiping royal flesh, but instead dressing it in silks and velvets. Yet the symbolism remained. It was still about intimacy, proximity, and the trust of a sovereign in his most vulnerable moments. But it was under Henry VIII that the position reached its strangest, most grotesque peak. For in his reign, wiping filth was not merely about cleanliness. It was about power, survival, and influence at the heart of the Tudor court. And though the velvet stool may have been emptied centuries ago, the story of the men who touched the king when no one else dared is a reminder that history, in all its majesty, is built upon filth. So in the end, the tale of Henry VIII's royal butt wipers isn't just grotesque trivia, it is a mirror of how power twists the world. In Tudor England, even the act of wiping filth could open the door to wealth, knighthood, and the ear of the most dangerous king in Europe. These men built their fortunes on excrement and humiliation, and some of them lost their heads because of it. It is a reminder that history's grandeur is often balanced on a mound of filth, and that power can make even the lowest, nistiest job a throne of influence. History is dark, and we must remember it.